Hello and welcome back once again. We are now on Friday as we've gone through the first week of February, and in this week we've got the new theme, because we're in a new month, of half and half, or two becomes one. I really can't decide which name to call it, so I'm calling it both. Yeah, half and half. As you can see, we've made a start on a digital version already. We have already done the paper version of this, guys, where I've gone and copied the whole image down, just the black and white version, and I used my own colours in this. But I did colour this on the paper, and yesterday, if you have come over from Instagram, you already know what I've done. But if you don't, go and check it out, guys. My name's Blut084, BLUT084, Art and Games. I'm here every single day on YouTube, occasionally on Mixer, but every day and night over on Instagram. Again, it's the same name, different place. All you got to do is type in my name and you should find me. But on the note of what we were doing, what we've done, on Monday we did... Monday we couldn't get around to do it, but normally on a Monday we'll do a sketch. Then on a Tuesday we will ink that sketch and put a bit of defining lines with a Sharpie and a fine line pen, my favourite part of the week. And then on Wednesday we do the colouring in with either Copic markers, felt tips, or just pencils that I've got lying around. That is on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, and that is live, guys. So if you have joined me on those streams, thank you very much for doing that. But if you've made it all the way to the end of the week, which is Friday today, you'll know that we've got round to starting the digital version. This part is already out and available to watch, guys, so you can go and check that out. It is this thumbnail here, so go and check that out, guys. Otherwise, enjoy what I'm going to be drawing today. As you can see here, I've just put the basic colours in and copied over the lines that I did for the paper version, which I drew myself. And I did a little bit of tweaking to the paper version, so that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be putting in the hair texture, and also we're going to be putting a defining shades in on the Spidey mask, because he's got I'm not going to give him a nose like a weird thing. I don't think it looks weird when you give him a nose. And when you give him a mouth and things, it just looks weird through the mouth. So I don't tend to do that. I like the new way they're doing it, where it's just a flat face mask and things like that. So yeah, that's what we're going to be sort of keeping up with. Going to be putting a bit of shading in, and as you can see here, I've already put a dark line, an outer dark line, and a little bit of dark shading here. We're going to be using the same colour as this and using the red, but darkening it out and using it for that. But on the face side, we're going to be doing a little bit more to the eye here, a bit of a shading around the nose, and putting in the actual hair, because yesterday, as you probably noticed, I've only put a spray faint lines here, or shading, so to sort of give it the idea that it's got hair and where the hair is going to be. I will use the texture tools today, like I do in all the second videos that I do for digital, burping as well. We'll be using these textures here, more than likely using the hair texture for the hair. Using these ones here for either this one here or this one here for the textures, or the shading, sorry. I might change the skin colour a little bit. It's looking a bit too orange, but hey, once we put the shading in, who knows what it's going to look like. So keep watching, guys, and enjoy the stream today. If you do like it, guys, don't forget to leave a like. Sorry, it's not a stream, it's a video. If you do like it, guys, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you're new to the channel. If you aren't new to the channel, let me know how you think I'm doing so far, as you must have been from the very beginning and been keeping up. And, guys, I have got something planned for April. So, if you would like to find out what that is, keep watching. Up until April, we have got something to do with Easter, as my name is Blut. That's as much as I'm going to say, and let you find out what Blut means in the French language. So you may get a little bit of a hint, so there's a hint for you there. But today we're going to be doing this, and I'm going to be listening to Comics Explained today. He's going to be explaining the Spider-Man and all the Spider-Man saga. We're actually in the Clone Saga at the moment. Quite being the Trail of Spider. What was it actually called? The video here we're watching is Spider-Man Quits, being Spider-Man. Spider-Man the Clone Saga, the Trail of Peter. So yeah, we're going to be listening to that today, guys, by Comics Explained. They're awesome, guys. They're also a YouTube channel. They explain comics, or Comics Explained does, but they've also got a brother company, which is called Comicstorian, which if you want to listen to any of that, go to the paper version of this week and check it out. I do listen to these every week, and every video has a different theme. So every video has something new from a comic, and they have hundreds and hundreds to listen to. So definitely go and check them out, guys. They are Comicstorian and Comics Explained. If you guys would like a link, let me know down below, because I'm lax and I don't always put them there. So let me know. Otherwise, enjoy and keep listening.
Alright guys, so we get into we get into the trial of Peter Parker, and this is this story is interesting. This story is a unique circumstance. It's a unique snowflake. That's what this story is. It's a very unique snowflake because of what happens at the end. And people who have read Spider-Man Clone Saga are just like, oh god. Oh man, I'm sorry, Peter. It's rough. It's a little bit rough. But what this does is this picks up with the confrontation between Peter Parker Spider-Man and Kaine. This is actually when they finally meet, they finally go face to face. Remember, Kaine had just been kind of making life a nightmare for Ben Reilly, really more so than Peter Parker. But the whole idea was that because Ben Reilly was a clone of Peter Parker, it all really just kind of came back on Peter himself. Now, the crazy thing about this is that Peter had previously broken out of jail before, but ultimately ended up going back in just because of the fact that it was causing more problems than it was worth. And so ultimately, Ben Reilly swapped places with Peter Parker, because to anybody out there who saw the two, they wouldn't know the difference. I mean, all the way down to like the fingerprint, they're basically the exact same. And what this did is it allowed Peter Parker to go forward and figure out who Kaine was and why Kaine was making life such a nightmare for Peter himself. Now, of course, with Peter out and about, this inevitably leads towards a confrontation between him and Kaine. And what we actually end up learning here is that Kaine views himself as more of an ally for Peter Parker than an actual enemy. And the reason why is because of the fact that what Kaine says is that everything he's done so far has been designed for the purpose of making life an absolute nightmare for Ben Reilly. Because in the mind of Kaine, Ben Reilly's the bad guy. Ben Reilly's the false one. Ben Reilly is the clone. He has no business being here. Now, this really kind of turns the tables on everything, just because of the fact that up until this point, it was believed that Kaine was just a legit villain. He was just a guy who was a jerk and just going around and trying to make life rough for everybody. But again, we didn't really know what his motivation was. We didn't know what the basis behind his actions were. And so ultimately, Peter Parker and Kaine end up fighting one another, if for no other reason than the fact that at the end of the day, Peter Parker cannot let an innocent man go to jail. Now, of course, the whole idea of who Kaine is and what he's about is revealed when Peter still fails to grasp what it is that Kaine's talking about. And so ultimately, Kaine pulls off his mask and reveals the fact that he is a clone of Peter Parker. Not only that, he was the first clone. And that's really kind of the crazy scenario here, because with regards to him revealing the fact that he's the first clone, we only get a brief little impasse here. What we're told by Kaine is that in the beginning, back with Amazing Spider-Man 149, when the Jackal was going through and creating clones of Peter Parker, the first one he made was Kaine himself. But the problem was that there was a degenerative illness with regards to Kaine, in the sense that he wasn't an exact duplicate. He wasn't a perfect clone. And so what ultimately ended up happening is the Jackal tried to get rid of Kaine. He literally just tried to kill him off. Now, of course, Kaine ended up making his escape and ultimately kind of, meandering around the world in the same way Ben Reilly did, which ultimately brought him back here. But this is a pretty huge revelation with regards to the idea of the whole clone saga, because now it changes the motivation behind everything. Now, of course, ultimately Peter still won't let Ben Reilly end up going to jail for something he didn't do. And so Peter Parker just kind of, walks into the courtroom alongside Kaine and basically says, look, you have to confess, you have to tell people what's going on. Now, of course, what ends up happening here is that because of the fact that Kaine had been looking to consistently kill Ben Reilly, he was always looking to simply eliminate him in his entirety, Kaine ultimately goes after Ben Reilly and tries to kill him off. Now, of course, this ends up seeing, Peter Parker and everybody stepping in, and ultimately Kaine stepping down, once he's basically defeated and actually held at gunpoint, which is really kind of a crazy situation. And so with Kane being in prison, he literally just confesses to all of his crimes, you know, so the murder of a former detective by the name of Luis Kennedy, to the murder of Dr. Octopus, how it was that he did it, that he broke his neck, the whole 9 yards. And so the crazy thing about this was that initially on the surface it seemed like, okay, well now we're done here. Like, I mean, the Clone Saga is pretty much over. Like, everything's all copacetic. I mean, the bad guy's been captured, you know, Ben Reilly's still out there, but surely they can come to terms, and it doesn't work out that way. Instead, what ends up happening is we actually see a guy by the name of Seward who's invoked here. Now, for the people who have never read anything about Clone Saga, I'm not going to go super in depth into Seward Trainer, just because of the fact that he has a really big part in this story. With the grand poobah revelation at the end of the whole thing, I do not want to spoil that, because it's actually a really, really cool reveal. And Seward Trainer has a pretty significant role in it all. But what we can say is that where Ben Reilly was just kind of traveling around the world and just trying to live his life, you know, aware of the fact that he was a clone and trying to make a life for himself, he eventually came across Seward Trainer. And Seward Trainer had formed a bond with Ben Reilly that was very akin to father and son. A lot of the life lessons that were sort of imparted to Ben Reilly, it was kind of like his own version of Uncle Ben in a lot of different ways. I mean, of course, Seward Trainer didn't die in the same capacity that Uncle Ben did, but at the very least, Seward Trainer was able to impart a lot of his own wisdom and his own experience. Now, the other half of this equation is that Seward Trainer is part of the Ben Reilly landscape at the moment because of the fact that there were suspected to be complications with regards to Mary Jane Watson and her baby. And so what ended up happening is Ben Reilly had actually taken Mary Jane Watson to visit Seward Trainer just to analyze her and make sure there was nothing going on. And Seward Trainer didn't find any problems. He was like, you know, you're going to give birth to a healthy baby, at least that seems to be the case. There won't be any complications in the pregnancy as far as we can tell. But what ended up happening is Seward Trainer had also analyzed, you know, the genes of Ben Reilly himself and came to the realization God, this story came to the realization that the father of Mary Jane Watson's baby was a clone. And so the implication here was that Peter Parker himself was the clone and not Ben Reilly. Now, this gets kind of crazy here. And the reason why is because of the fact that Seward Trainer's like, look, guys, all you have to do is just kind of analyze yourselves, test your own DNA. Now, this is where the story, I mean, if the story hadn't gone off the rails by now, this is where it's fully off the rails. I mean, there's no tracks. This train is just careening down the hillside. It is, it's rough. It's a little weird because this was one of those things where Marvel was trying to like thicken the plot, where it was like, oh man, you think you know what's going on, but you have no idea. And the problem with this was that by this point in time, fans had had enough. And that's why we skipped over so much of that stuff, because it was totally unnecessary. I mean, there were so many things that had no reason to be in this story. Judas Traveler and all that kind of stuff, we delved into him a little bit, but only insofar as we needed to understand the story at the time. But the idea was that while this was all going on, we ended up having Miles Warren the Jackal, who made his escape. And his goal was to basically create an entire world of clones using his carry-on virus. So there were a lot of unnecessary aspects to the story, because remember, this was all supposed to be a new status quo. This was not supposed to be a story arc. This was all supposed to be a pretty limited story that ended up seeing Peter Parker basically removed and Ben Reilly taking his place. And where it was initially successful, it spun out so fast by editorial mandate that it was like, just keep writing, guys. We don't care what you write. Just keep writing things, slap Clone Saga on it, and sell it. It got to the point where it was 200 some odd issues of just absolute nonsense. So that's why we skipped over so much of that stuff. I mean, in all honesty, we could have covered it, but by the time we got to this point, you would have just been like, okay, I don't care. Like, I really don't care about the Clone Saga. And I guarantee almost nobody would have been watching this video. So it would have been pretty rough. I don't even know if people are going to watch this video now. I have no idea how many people are going to watch it. People are just like, I heard about that story, don't care. So I have no idea how people are going to respond. But ultimately, you know, because of the fact that Mary Jane Watson kind of, you know, beseeches Peter Parker and says, look, even if you're not sure about this, you know, even if you don't want to do this, do it for me, do it for the baby. At the very least, it'll give us a peace of mind. Peter Parker subjects himself to these tests and basically goes through alongside Ben Reilly, analyzing their DNA, so on and so forth. We end up finding out that Peter Parker is the actual clone. At least that's what we're told. Peter Parker's a clone and Ben Reilly is the real one. And so so because of this, it just kind of spins things out. I mean, at this point, it really just kind of goes absolutely nuts. Peter Parker, of course, begins to lose his mind, and in his rage and in his anger, he actually backhands Mary Jane Watson and hits her in the exact same way that Hank Pym hit Janet Van Dyne. So again, this is one of those things that we talked about when it came to the whole idea with regards to Hank Pym and the kind of stigma that he encountered, that one-off where he hit Janet Van Dyne. Peter Parker's done the exact same thing. Reed Richards backhanded Susan Storm on a multitude of occasions, you know, back in the old 1960s, 1970s stories. So that was one of the big things about why Hank Pym fans get so bent out of shape whenever something like that's brought up. But what this also does is it really kind of sets the stage for the future of the story in the sense that it asks the question, what happens next? Like, what's going to go on now with regards to Peter Parker actually having been revealed to be the clone himself? So again, this video is pretty short. I mean, it's not a super lengthy one. You know, at this point, it just kind of leads into the idea of, you know, this sort of ultimate fallout, this ultimate event, and this huge revelation in terms of who it is that's actually behind the Clone Saga and who's behind, you know, the producing of all these clones with regards to, you know, Peter Parker and so on and so forth. But again, I mean, this is one of the reasons, this is one of the things that we did. You know, we kind of went through here, we skimmed through a lot of this stuff, we ended up just kind of bypassing a lot of things. It's one of the reasons why I went to Sal over at Comic Pop and I was like, look, I know Clone Saga is filled with all kinds of unnecessary stuff. Give me the core stories on what happens if you can. And this is what we have. I mean, you know, this is basically the core set of events as it unfolds. And this was, again, just kind of a change in the landscape. You know, it was designed to sort of revitalize, shift things up a little bit. The problem was that with this revelation, fans had just kind of gotten sick and tired of the Clone Saga. They were effectively done. They were like, look, this needs to wrap up and it needs to be finished, which of course we'll get to in the next video when we cover the conclusion of the Clone Saga. But in any event, again, this is a pretty short video, but if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you guys later. Peace.
So guys, I'm just putting in the shading here.
What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button, and make sure you hit subscribe
slowly building
so
it up.
Decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Alright, so as we get to the conclusion of Spider-Man Clone Saga, one of the questions that I've seen in the comments is, why didn't we cover the whole thing? Alright, here's the reason why we didn't cover the whole thing. Here's a really good example. There's a point in the story where Gwen Stacy comes back, and we learn that the Gwen Stacy we see in the story is a clone pretending to be a woman, pretending to be a clone. That's just one example, and there's a multitude of others. For example, between the story Crossfire, I think it was, that dealt with this guy, Judas Traveler, who could cast illusions. Guy had nothing to do with Clone Saga. But between that story and the trial of Peter Parker, the last video that we did, about 3 months passed, in the sense that the trial of Peter Parker was released 3 months after it was originally supposed to be. It basically fell behind by about 3 months or so. Because of that, what Marvel did is they went through and they basically just flooded the entire Spider-Man landscape with nothing but like one-shots and miniseries. They were just giving us stories that had almost nothing to do with the Clone Saga, or if they did associate with the Clone Saga, they didn't move the story in any direction. It was literally just filling time. And so because of that, if I were to go through and make those videos, one, I would get lost. I would get confused. I'd have to go back and we'd probably end up seeing delays on the videos. And between all the declaration of retcons and changes and all that kind of good stuff, it would confuse me and it would probably confuse you, and you'd probably get frustrated and just stop watching the video. But one of the big revelations that came with all this was the fact that where previously it was believed that the Jackal was the one who was behind all the events of the Clone Saga, that the Jackal was the one who had made Ben Reilly, the Jackal was the one who had made Kane, the Jackal was the one that set all these events in motion and all that kind of good stuff. What ended up happening is Marvel basically came back and said, no, that's not true. Everything we've told you was a lie. And that's why fans got so bent out of shape and why they got so angry, is because just when they thought they were beginning to get a grasp on this insanely convoluted story, well then suddenly Marvel came along and said, no, that's actually not true at all. Instead, the real mastermind behind the entire events of the Clone Saga is none other than Norman Osborn. Now, this was kind of cool, but it was also kind of weird. I personally thought it was interesting that Norman Osborn had made a return, and the way that this was done, the way his return was written, was actually kind of interesting. I mean, there are those who just hated this. They absolutely despised it. But there were some like me who didn't really think it was that bad. But with regards to Norman Osborn, this is the first time he comes back in Marvel Comics following his death at the hands of Peter Parker after the night when Stacy died. Norman Osborn had basically died in Amazing Spider-Man issues 121 and 122 during the fight between himself and Peter Parker after the death of Gwen Stacy. The story was really kind of leading up to the death of the Green Goblin. The biggest problem that Marvel had, though, was that the Green Goblin was huge in terms of popularity. I mean, it was absolutely nuts. And so because of that, Marvel had to eventually bring him back, or they had to bring back the Green Goblin concept in some form or fashion. Now, what this story does is it actually invokes a lot of that stuff, but it tells us what it was that Norman Osborn was doing behind the scenes. What we know is that, again, because he would basically just kind of resurrected, or at least he had just come back to life just because of the goblin formula in his veins that basically allowed his body to heal, which allowed him to come back, instead of just immediately popping up on the scene and just saying, I'm Norman Osborn, and going back and attacking Peter Parker again. Instead, because of the fact that the death of Gwen Stacy had unhinged Peter Parker to a degree, I mean, it didn't make him crazy, but because it had unhinged him to a degree, the goal of Osborn was to basically take away everything that Peter Parker cared about. And so what he ended up doing was basically operating behind the scenes and building an empire of sorts for himself. Now, one of the other reasons why it was that Osborn didn't intervene, at least the indication is given here, is because of the fact that his son Harry Osborn had taken up the mantle of Green Goblin. Again, that was something that had already been written, and so really, because this has already been established, because it was an intrinsic part of the Spider-Man mythos, Marvel couldn't go back and change it, right? Like, that's the nature of a retcon in a lot of different ways. For those of you guys who are new to comic books, a retcon stands for retroactive continuity. And what that means is that there are, concrete pillars in the realm of Marvel Comics. For example, Captain America Steve Rogers, or I guess the guy Steve Rogers, received an injection that gave him the super soldier serum, which led to him becoming Captain America. Peter Parker was bitten by a radioactive spider. Those are things that do not change. The motivation for why those happened have changed from time to time. And that's how a retcon works. For example, with regards to Captain America, it was previously believed that there was just a guy named Abraham Erskine that injected him with the super soldier serum and he became Captain America. Done and done. It was simple as that. It wasn't until years later that we learned he was the first in a long line of people that were part of Weapons Plus. He was Weapon 1, which went all the way up to Weapon X or Weapon 10, that led to Wolverine. So that's what I'm talking about when I say retroactive continuity. The idea of Harry Osborn having donned the Green Goblin costume and becoming the second Green Goblin, that's something that's unshakable, that's concrete. You can't get rid of that in the Spider-Man landscape because it's so intrinsic to Peter Parker himself and his relationship to Harry Osborn. And so instead of changing that, Marvel had to work around that and just say, well, Norman Osborn was just in the background watching all these events unfold. And it's like that with virtually everything that goes on. When it comes to Phil Urich being the next iteration of the Green Goblin and then going on to become the Hobgoblin. Marvel couldn't change those because they're concrete aspects of the Spider-Man mythos. So instead, when it came to Norman Osborn, they had to simply work around it by having him just watch all these events unfold. Now, what Osborn had done is, while he was in the background, again, because he was forming an empire, what he needed were resources. He needed a vast network of information. And so what he did is he actually joined a group called the Brotherhood of the Screers. Now, the Brotherhood of the Screers is a cabal that's been around for forever and ever and ever and ever. And they really just kind of like worship this cosmic entity, so to speak, where one of these elder gods that has supposedly been around for decades. It's one of those instances where Marvel, kind of brings in like a cabal or like a cult of sorts and says this cult worships a particular god, and this god is a god that we just made up, but he's been around for a few, million years or billions of years or whatever. It's just one of those things they interject in a story just for the sake of giving this group a particular basis. But the fact remains that being part of the Brotherhood of the Screers meant that with Norman Osborn, because the Screers care only about money and power and accumulating it in any means necessary, it basically gave Norman Osborn access to a vast array of money and resources that he wouldn't normally have. And so what he was able to do is, while he wasn't in New York itself, he was basically operating out of Europe, it allowed him to use his network to keep tabs on everything that was going on. And what this did is it led to Osborn learning that the Jackal Miles Warren was creating clones. That after the death of Gwen Stacy and, Peter Parker kind of defeating Norman Osborn, that Miles Warren, who was in love with Gwen Stacy, chose to get his revenge on Peter Parker by cloning Gwen Stacy and cloning Peter himself. And this is when the whole basis of the idea of Kane and Ben Reilly and all that stuff begins to come into play. Because what ended up happening here is that where Miles Warren basically dispatched one of his guys, one of his Spear agents, to go meddle with things and to keep an eye on things, we found out this happened in two forms. The first was in the form of Miles Warren himself, and the second was Seward Trainer. Because of the fact that Miles Warren was creating these clones, while Osborn didn't really ally himself with Miles Warren, what he did do is he looked at his views and said, I can use the work that Miles Warren's trying to achieve for my own goals somewhere later on down the line. And so Skrier basically showed up and said, I will help you achieve what it is that you want to do. I will not tell you who I'm working for, and I will not tell you why, but I will help you achieve this goal. And Miles Warren the Jackal just accepted that aid because in truth he really kind of needed it. At the same time, Seward Trainer was a guy who was basically working for the Jackal. Now again, in our last video we had covered Seward Trainer as simply saying that Seward was a longtime friend of Ben Reilly. He was really intelligent when it came to genetics, and of course he's a guy that, you know, was the one that made the revelation, made the statement that Peter Parker's the clone and Ben Reilly's the original. The reason for that is because of the fact that this Skrier had shown up to Seward Trainer while he was trying to steal information from the Jackal and said, I will keep your secret. I will not tell the Jackal that you're trying to steal his documents and his notes so you can pawn it off as your own, and instead, you know, I will come to you at some point along the line and I will ask a favor. And so in the background of all this stuff, with the help of the Skrier, Miles Warren created Kane as the first clone. Kane suffered from cellular degeneration and was basically discarded by Miles Warren. This led to Miles Warren trying again and then eventually creating Ben Reilly and Gwen Stacy. Now of course this led into the very first time that Ben Reilly and Peter Parker fought one another, which we saw in the events of the original Amazing Spider-Man Clone Saga story in Spider-Man 149, 150, and 151 I think it was. Now, because of the fact that this conflict had eventually led to the idea of Peter Parker defeating Ben Reilly, again, Peter looked at the clone and said, if anybody becomes aware of the fact that this clone is here and they unmask it, they'll look at this clone's face and realize that Spider-Man is Peter Parker. My identity will be out there in the world. And so Peter had basically taken the body of the clone, dumped it down a smokestack, and walked away. What we found out was that Miles Warren had basically taken this clone out of the smokestack and then replaced it with a clone skeleton, and then just sort of sent Ben Reilly along the way, messing with his mind a little bit. Now again, Miles Warren didn't do this because Norman Osborn told him to. Norman Osborn was just watching all these events unfold from the background. Instead, Miles Warren was doing all of this of his own accord. But what it did afford him to do is the chance to basically look at this and say, I can grab this corpse somewhere along the line if I want to and use it for my own ends. But the whole idea of Osborn was looking at the character of Ben Reilly. And the reason for this was because his hope, even though it wasn't really part of his main plan, his hope was that with Ben Reilly basically revealing to Peter Parker that he was alive, that Reilly himself was alive, and that Reilly was basically a clone of Peter that intended to be there, that it would unhinge Peter in his entirety, and it would basically send his entire life into a tailspin, possibly drive him insane, and he'd be institutionalized, or any number of things that would lead to his life going into complete and total disarray. The problem with this is that, as we know, that didn't happen. Instead, what basically took place was that Peter himself ended up bonding with Ben Reilly. The two of them were very akin to brothers. When Mary Jane Watson became pregnant, Peter Parker ultimately ended up leaving and vacating the role. Now, what this does is this begins the process of bringing in some of the interim stories that took place between the trial of Peter Parker and the conclusion of Spider-Man Clone Saga. Now, one of the reasons why we left some of those stories out is just because of the fact that this covers everything. But what Norman Osborn did is where Peter said, okay, look, Ben Reilly, according to Seward Trainer, according to the revelation that he gave us, you are the one who is the original. I'm the clone. I'm taking my wife. You know, we've smoothed things over after I, slapped her across the face, basically. We're taking off to Oregon, and we are going to go live a normal life. You be Spider-Man here in New York. Now, of course, when that happened, fans were pissed. I mean, they were so angry. It was one of the craziest things ever. People were just so outraged because they wanted Peter Parker to stay. It's the Spider-Man they've grown attached to. And in a lot of ways, that makes sense. I mean, remember, Spider-Man has a heritage in the realm of comic books. He's the one that really set the stage in a lot of different ways. The Teen Titans were his predecessor to a degree, but in terms of the standing that Spider-Man created, the mark that he basically left in the comic book community, it'll stand the test of time. I mean, remember, ever since the 1940s, there were no kid superheroes, and if you were a kid superhero, you were a sidekick. The Teen Titans set the stage by saying, we as teenagers can have our own stories, but they were a team. But Spider-Man was the first time that we saw a successful teenager on the main stage with his own solo story. Spider-Man really helped to empower a lot of teenage kids who sat around wishing, man, I wish I could be a superhero too. And that's why Spider-Man was so significant, and that's why he changed so many things. And so with Peter Parker being moved out of the landscape, all that time that people had grown with his character, all those experiences that they had, all the times they'd seen him struggle, whether they had gotten in during the night when Stacy died or read afterwards when he had picked up in a relationship with Mary Jane Watson, they were part and parcel to his life, and they didn't want to see that go away. And so because of that, there was a lot of backlash to the idea of Ben Reilly taking over the role, but Marvel kept on keeping on. And so what we saw was that with the exception of a couple of instances when Peter Parker would appear in the comics, all the villains, all the stories of Spider-Man fighting Mysterio and Venom and Carnage and so on and so forth, all that dealt with Ben Reilly. Now, there was an event that ended up bringing Peter Parker back, and this was basically Norman Osborn grabbing the corpse, or at least having the smokestack torn down, that resulted in people discovering this corpse that was wearing a Spider-Man outfit. Now, because of the fact that Ben Reilly himself didn't know about this, because Peter Parker didn't know about this, ultimately they ended up coming back. Because remember, in Peter Parker's mind, the body he threw down the smokestack was gone. That was Ben Reilly, but there was never any reason for him to question whatever happened to that body in the smokestack. He just kind of wondered, well, I guess Ben Reilly survived or something, I have no idea. And that was really it. There really wasn't a whole lot of exposition or a whole lot of investigation there. But with this body being discovered, the question became, okay, where did this body come from and what's going on? And so it led to Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson coming back. The other half of this, and it's really one of the most tasteless things that I've ever seen in comic books, was the idea of the child that Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson had. Because of the fact that fans wanted to see Spider-Man come back, Marvel said, fine, we'll give you Peter Parker, but it's going to come at a cost. And so what they did is they basically had the child of Mary Jane Watson and Peter Parker killed. Like, it died. It was stillborn, which that's not really something that I agree with, and it's not something that I would bring up in this video, but it's probably a question people are going to have, so I figure we might as well answer it. Not the best decision that Marvel's made over the course of their life. Those people who read far enough back to remember the Clone Saga, look at that moment, maybe some of the other events in Clone Saga and Spider-Man One More Day, and say, I don't understand. I don't grasp what it is that's going. That was a really poor decision on behalf of Marvel. At least that's how they look at it anyway. And regardless of how it played out, it resulted in Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson coming back to New York to investigate everything that was going on. Now, with the return of Peter Parker, Norman Osborn effectively had to speed up his own plans. But something else that I also want to talk about here is the character of Kaine. And the reason why is because of the fact that Kaine had just kind of been left out in no man's land following the events of the trial of Peter Parker. He was still a character, he was still in the stories, but he didn't nearly play the same kind of role that he did before, because all of his involvement, everything that we had seen about him being mysterious, nobody really knowing what he was, all that basically led up to the trial of Peter Parker when he revealed himself to be the very first clone. After that, it's like, well, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? And so what ended up happening is Kaine actually ended up going back to the Jackal, Miles Warren, in order to try to find a way to cure him of his clone degeneration. Miles Warren more or less scoffed at him, laughed him off. At the same time, the Jackal basically wanted to create like a giant planet full of clones. This led to a massive conflict between Spider-Man and Ben Reilly and Kaine and the Jackal and so on and so forth. But presumably Kaine was believed to have been killed. He was thrown in a regeneration tube, eventually came back, and then handed himself over to the cops, for the crimes that he had committed and the things that he had done before. So it was a way for Marvel to just kind of quickly dispense of him, just say, okay, fine, whatever, Kaine's gone, who cares? And that was it. And so by the time we got to the conclusion of the Clone Saga, we basically ended up picking up with just Ben Reilly and Spider-Man himself. Now remember, all these things with Norman Osborn took place behind the scenes. Peter Parker, Ben Reilly, none of these guys had any idea that this was going on. They had no idea that Norman Osborn was still alive. And so what's really cool here is the way that this picks up, this last little tidbit, we actually end up having like J. Jonah Jameson and Robbie Robertson, the editor-in-chief of the Daily Bugle. They're all basically brought to the Daily Bugle in this one particular room for a meeting. But the crazy thing is that they've all received invitations from different people. And so this was done directly by Norman Osborn, who basically revealed himself to be alive to Peter Parker. And the way that this ended up happening is he basically just kind of said, subdues him by using some sort of gas that basically permeates his body and is designed specifically for Peter, just kind of a targeted gas that, keeps him woozy and keeps him aware of what's going on. But ultimately, Norman Osborn basically just reveals everything that we just went over, so we don't really have to go over it again. But this is all brand new to Peter Parker, and that's the crazy thing, is because he has no idea that any of this stuff happened. He had no idea what was taking place. Not only that, Norman Osborn demonstrates that he had captured and defeated Ben Reilly. Now, this is something that had taken place in a different comic. I didn't really feel like it was necessary to run over just because of the fact that we could cover it here. Whether we go through and do the comic play-by-play or discuss it, it's still more or less the same thing. Ben Reilly is basically defeated and incapacitated by the Green Goblin. And so what this was designed to do anyway was lead to this great big huge return of the Green Goblin himself. Not only that, Ben actually reveals to Peter Parker that where Norman had basically taunted him after defeating him, saying, hey look, I'm going to kill all the most important members of Peter Parker's family, Ben Reilly divulges this information to Peter and says, everybody that you know, J. Jonah Jameson, Robbie Robertson, all the people that you've met over the course of your life who are significant to you, Green Goblin's going to kill them all. He's going to kill every last one of them. And so what this does is it turns into a race against time. It turns into Peter Parker trying to get to the Green Goblin as fast as he can and ultimately defeat him. Now at this point, it really turns into kind of a cat and mouse game. And that's really the way it works when it comes to the Green Goblin and, Spider-Man fighting. It's always this idea of, Green Goblin chasing Spider-Man around, Spider-Man running away while he formulates a plan, turning the tables on the Green Goblin. It's really kind of a hallmark of their characters, or at least, when they first fought anyway. But the fact remains, with Norman Osborn, the way he intended to basically take down all these different members of Spider-Man's family, more or less, or the people that he knows, is to literally booby trap the building and then just destroy it in its entirety using these different, bombs that he's created, these different goblin bombs. Now, of course, Ben Reilly is able to get them out, but again, this continues to lead into a fight directly between Peter and Norman Osborn. Now, something to keep in mind here is that this is not just like a regular fight, right? Like, Peter Parker looked at the entire events of the Clone Saga, because while we didn't go over every single thing, you have to think about it from the mind of Peter. Peter's been told he's a clone. On 2 occasions, he's come across 2 other clones of himself. Mary J. Watson was pregnant. He was going to have a child that basically ended up dying. And then he finds out the entirety of his life with regards to all these clones has been manipulated by Norman Osborn. And on top of all of that, Aunt May passed away. Peter Parker is about as close to being as insane as he's ever going to be. Totally losing his mind. Going against Norman Osborn with his, the goblin formula inside of his own blood, in a lot of ways, allows Peter to actually cut loose. And that's really what this is. It's a chance for Peter to basically just sort of cut loose and take out all of his anger and all of his wrath on Norman Osborn, and rightfully so. That's one of the reasons why this was kind of a big deal, is because of the fact that it's not like Norman Osborn just happened to show up at the wrong time and say, I'm back, and Peter just lost his mind and attacked Norman Osborn. Norman is the source of all the suffering that Peter Parker has experienced in a lot of different ways. Now keep in mind, Norman's not responsible for the death of Aunt May. He's not responsible for the death of Peter Parker's daughter. He's an easy target because he's basically screwed up everything else. And so again, in the midst of trying to kill Peter, what he actually does is try to kill him using his own goblin glider, only for Ben Reilly to jump in the way and to be impaled by it. Now, this was Marvel sitting down and saying, okay, look, we tried. We tried to get rid of Peter Parker. We tried to eliminate him. We tried to replace him with Ben Reilly. Nobody wanted him there. The biggest problem that Marvel faced, though, was that if they, let's say, for example, they left Ben Reilly alive. Somebody could have come along and said, oh, guess what, guys? Remember that Clone Saga? Well, it turns out Ben Reilly was the original the entire time. It would have just reopened this massive Pandora's box of things that people just didn't want to come back anymore. It would have just, restarted this whole great big huge era that people would rather just kind of leave in the past, that even Marvel itself would rather leave in the past. And so because of this, with Norman Osborn basically being responsible for the death of Ben Reilly, it leads to this final conflict between the two of them. Norman Osborn is able to make his escape. He's able to get away, and the Green Goblin lives yet again. But Peter Parker is also able to basically give Ben Reilly the farewell that he deserves. But the way that Marvel came along and said, Ben Reilly is definitively the clone, Spider-Man is definitively the original, is because of the fact that when Ben Reilly basically dies, his body breaks down and it just kind of dissolves. And the reason why that matters is because of the fact that in addition to Ben Reilly and Kane, there were a whole host of other clones that we didn't even talk about. We didn't really get their names or anything like that. They were for the most part nameless, and it was really a segment whereby the Jackal had like this army of clones chase down Ben Reilly over the course of the city. All the clones were basically defeated, or they were all killed off, and then they just more or less disintegrated. But it was Marvel establishing the fact that this is what happens to clones. Whenever clones are defeated or whenever they die, their bodies just break down and they just sort of dissolve and go away. And so this was essentially killing off the character of Ben Reilly, saying Ben Reilly's gone and he's never going to come back again, or at least, not in this capacity. So again, that basically ended the Clone Saga. It essentially all just kind of called it a day. Everything went away. Peter Parker, of course, goes back to Mary Jane Watson, after realizing that his child had essentially died, and the two of them grieve the best they can. But ultimately, it creates this kind of clean break where it sets the stage for the follow-up stories of Peter Parker absent the Clone Saga and dealing a little bit with the aftermath, but almost immediately sweeping it all under the rug and moving on to the next best thing. But with that being said, guys, we have finished this Clone Saga. I mean, we did the best of what we had. I think we did a pretty good job. Hopefully you got the core of everything and it all came together pretty well. And hopefully you guys understand everything that's going on in terms of the characters and the events and, the intricacies of, the important things anyway. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Core. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.
Still being in Texas, guys, I wasn't happy with the way it looks, so now I'm going to be sort of tweaking and dodging and mixing and getting things to go together and just trying to really make it work.
This is Rob.
As you know, I've done a couple bits already. I'm really not happy with that face, so I'm going to go around everything with a slight darker brush, just using the basic one now. Still need to do these lips, but I'll do those in a minute. Trying to kind of emulate what I did on the paper. I did find a good way of giving it shading, but just don't seem to be able to get it here. I'll keep trying now. And if I don't get it in this video, guys, don't forget to hit subscribe and come on back next time. But we're not going to go anywhere for a minute. I've got roughly 20 more minutes I can be doing this, so maybe we'll just get the face side done today, and then we'll do this side tomorrow for the Spider-Man. But yeah, I'm not super happy with this at the minute. It may be because I'm rushing it a little bit. Who knows? Just seems a bit dark, you see what I mean? It's not looking too bad. I mean, I like down here, I like the chin, I like this bit here. I might tweak this a little bit actually. Blend that in a bit. Use the blender so we've not got that seems to be working a bit better. So we haven't got loads of horrible outside lines or lines at all, really. I like try and get rid of as much as possible with the blender, like that. Sometimes it does need a little bit decent sort of defining shadow. I just don't always know what colour to use. As for the eye, it just basically looks the same as I did it, but who knows? Do you reckon it looks different, guys? Let me know in the comment section. And while I carry on tweaking, let's listen to a bit more from Comics Explained.
And if you're enjoying the content that
A
I'm
New
uploading on
Spider,
my
The
channel,
Amazing
then feel free to
Spider-Man
subscribe.
Volume
You can
1,
also
big
offer
time.
suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel. Okay, so Spider-Man Homecoming comes out in July. And after finishing The Incredible Hulk, a lot of people really seem to enjoy the idea of like long series, like picking a character, a team, or something like that, and just doing like an entire run, just covering like when one writer takes over the title and just does like a whole run. You know, Greg Pak's Incredible Hulk is a really good example. It's also the reason why I think I'm going to go ahead and dive into it, but it's also the reason why we're going to do Jeff Johns' Green Lantern, because it was so good. That's going to take like a year and a half to finish. It's insane how long it is. But that's also what we're doing Injustice, is because, you know, they're really popular runs, people really enjoy them. I really enjoy them. them, and so I figured I'd go ahead and cover them. But with Spider-Man Homecoming coming out in July, I intended to do all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man, when Spider-Man Homecoming came out. But after, the idea of people loving the Incredible Hulk so much, I sat down and I said, okay, well, the issue with Spider-Man, all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man, is the fact that it's basically just a continuation of Dan Slott's run from when he first took over the title. It's all just one great, big, huge, giant story. And so because of that, I kind of figured, well, why not go back and do Dan Slott's run? Because it really starts with Spider-Man big time, taking Peter Parker back to his roots the way he should be in the eyes of Dan Slott and really in the eyes of a lot of fans. And then basically moving forward all the way through the events of Spider Island, all the way through the events of Superior Spider-Man, Spider-Verse, all that kind of stuff. And then basically ending with all new, or really kind of picking up with all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man by the time the movie comes out. That's what I'm shooting for here. And the way I have it scheduled, it should work out. Coming out every Monday, it would just be a Spider-Man video running up until all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man in July. But a couple things that I want to run over here as we get into this is really J. Michael Straczynski's run. I don't want to go super in-depth into it, but there are a few things that we need to highlight. First and foremost was One More Day. One More Day is one of the most divisive stories among Spider-Man fans. There are a lot of people that just hate it. They hate it. Usually it's because, people who picked up Spider-Man before the events of One More Day. So they were reading about the marriage and the struggles and trials and tribulations between Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson. They came to identify with him. They loved the marriage between the two of them. Peter and Mary Jane Watson were never like Superman and Lois Lane level couple, but they were the most popular couple in Marvel Comics. They were kind of like Marvel's power couple in a lot of different ways. There were a few people who just hopped on the bandwagon. They just hated One More Day because it was the popular thing to do. But if you were one of those people who, went back and read Spider-Man before the events of One More Day and then went through One More Day and picked up after, a lot of people hated it. But after the events of One More Day, there was Brand New Day. And Brand New Day basically said, here's the new starting point for Peter Parker. And people hated that just as much as they hated One More Day, because it basically said now, Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson are no longer married. They basically ended their marriage by selling it off more or less to Mephisto in order to make sure that Aunt May lived. Because of the fact that she was dying at the time, it was granting Aunt May a new lease on life. Now, with Brand New Day going forward, Straczynski made a lot of changes. One of the first things he did is he took the character of Aunt May and said, okay, she's been single and alone long enough. Ever since Peter Parker was first introduced, Uncle Ben had died and she's basically been alone for the last 40 some odd years. Let's give her someone. And so what he did is he basically he paired her up with J. Jonah Jameson Sr., the father of J. Jonah Jameson, the head of Daily Bugle that hates Peter Parker. And so because of this, the two of them basically paired off. Fans, there were fans who loved it, fans who hated it. It was kind of a mixed reaction. But then J. Michael Straczynski also got rid of the Daily Bugle. And the way he did this was by interjecting stories of J. Jonah Jameson having heart attacks, different things like that. But it was basically the idea that the Daily Bugle had been struggling. And so what happened was a financier, a guy by the name of Daniel Bennett, I think it was, came along and basically bought it. Now, it was done against the will of J. Jonah Jameson, and in fact, he was hospitalized at the time that it actually happened. Instead, it was really J. Jonah Jameson's wife, Marla, who engineered the selling of the Daily Bugle. But essentially, this more or less led to everybody being sent off. It was really people just not really being tied into the Daily Bugle. And so because of that, it was removed from the landscape in a lot of ways. But then we also had Peter Parker. Now, Peter Parker and J. Jonah Jameson, one of the cool things that Straczynski focused on was this notion that the two of them had this kind of respect. J. Jonah Jameson always looked at Peter Parker as not really a surrogate son, but somebody that he had a lot of respect for. The issue with this was that when Peter Parker revealed his identity during the events of Civil War, J. Jonah Jameson flipped. He hit the roof. And what it did is it shattered the trust that he had in Peter Parker, and it more or less, created a vendetta stronger than it had ever been between J. Jonah Jameson, Peter Parker, and Spider-Man. And so what happened is eventually Spider-Man basically saves the life of J. Jonah Jameson during an encounter with the Vulture. But a security guard had sacrificed his life in the process to, try to protect Jameson. And while Jameson looked at the death of the security guard and said that was honorable, that was a great thing that he did, Peter Parker doctored a photo to make it look like Jameson had fought off the Vulture. And so what happened is Jameson took this as an affront and said, basically, you're insulting the identity of the security guard. You're insulting the memory of the security guard who basically saved my life. And so Peter Parker was essentially ousted from the Daily Bugle. And so that's why he's currently unemployed when it comes to this. Now, there were a couple things that were introduced here and there, and we'll cross that bridge when we get to. But with regards to Spider-Man Big Time, this is really, again, Dan Slott making Peter Parker his own. Now, keep in mind, this is all after the events of Civil War, so on and so forth. Steve Rogers has already returned to the landscape. And so what this does is it gives us the Avengers, really the Mighty Avengers as it exists right now, with Thor, Jessica Drew, Spider-Woman, Iron Man, Wolverine, Captain America, Hawkeye, so on and so forth. And they're basically responding to the robots of Dr. Octopus wreaking havoc in New York. Now, this is really Dan Slott leading up to the events of Superior Spider-Man when Otto Octavius took over the body of Peter Parker. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people loved the early early run of Dan Slott, because there were so many plot threads that started in Big Time and extended out into everything, and it took, 4 or 5 years in order for it to all come to fruition. But when it did, it felt rewarding. It felt like this great, big, huge, incredible experience. And so, really, with the various superheroes going through and fighting against, these guys, we pick up with J. Jonah Jameson, and again with Marla. Now, of course, because of the trials and tribulations they'd experienced, they were going through couples counseling, different things like that. But again, it's really just Dan Slott saying, hey, here's where we reside. We have J. Jonah Jameson as mayor right now. We have him and Marla dealing with family issues, dealing with couple issues. Is again, taking the stories very much back to the grounded level of traditional superheroes and traditional characters as we knew them, albeit in some slightly different roles. But what we do at this point is we pick up with Captain America. Now, within this story, this is really just kind of a not really a side plot, but kind of a side thing, but it really ties into Dr. Octopus. But this is a small version of what I'm talking about when I talk about, instances where Dan Slott's building into bigger things, because this is not actually Steve Rogers. Instead, what happens is Steve Rogers tells this guy who's standing guard with regards to this Vertex shuttle to basically go away, to say, hey, look, you're relieved of guard duty. I'm going to go ahead and take over here just because of the fact that this is one of the most important artifacts that we have right now. Not anyone can just keep an eye on it. Now, of course, the other cool thing here is Dan Slott builds on the legacy of Captain America, and that's one of the interesting things here is in Marvel Comics, you have characters that are interchangeable, and you have characters that are concrete, characters that do not change. Some characters that are interchangeable might be like Moon Knight, for example. Different writers can take a different view of the character, write him differently, bring in characters, remove characters, things like that. Steve Rogers is not that way. He's a concrete character, and he's always the guy who's like, freedom above all else. He always fights for freedom. He never fights for anything other than freedom. That's the biggest reason why the change of Steve Rogers becoming a Hydra agent during All New, All Different Marvel was so controversial, is because there were a lot of people who were clinging on to these old stories and didn't want to see the Steve Rogers concept move forward, didn't really want to see it change. They wanted him to stay Captain America, and rightfully so, because people latch on to different aspects of different characters as time goes on, and the one that they love the most is the one that they don't want to see change. So it's natural to have that kind of response. But again, picking back up with Peter Parker, we basically joined with the arrival of Felicia Hardy. Now, she doesn't get a whole lot of screen time here in the opening salvo for Big Time. She actually becomes important later on down the line. But again, she's just one of the funny members, one of the members of the Spider family, so to speak. But there's also a little banter back in here. And again, this is really just Dan Slott saying, hey, Felicia Hardy, she's one of the characters that you all know and love. She's definitely going to play a major role in the story. It's always kind of fun to see. But the other funny thing here is she arrives on the scene to help Peter Parker, bail him out of an otherwise dangerous situation. And she's like, yeah, so what's the chances of me becoming an Avenger? And Peter Parker, of course, is like, none. There's no chance of you becoming an Avenger. There's not a single solitary chance. Sorry about your luck. But again, from here, the cool thing, and one of the things I love the most about Dan Slott's writing when it came to this opening, this opening thing, was really the idea of how Peter Parker sees himself. Because what he does is he sits down and he says, hey, look, I basically have a new life going on now. I'm with my new girlfriend, Carly Cooper. I'm not with Mary Jane Watson anymore. He talks about the idea of Aunt May being in a relationship with J. Jonah Jameson Sr., but he also addresses himself in relation to other superheroes. He says he's not a heavy hitter like Thor. He's not one of the big-time geniuses like Reed Richards or Tony Stark. But that's the irony of this, is that he very much is. Peter Parker is extremely smart. He's one of the smartest men out there. And it's really this sort of humble nature that people like, where he doesn't sit down and say, yeah, I'm one of the smartest people out there. It's always the idea that in his mind, there's always someone smarter. There's always someone out there that's capable of more. But we as the reader know that that's not really the case, that Spider-Man is one of the smartest people out there. Now, at this point, we pick back up again with Andrew Air Force Base. And again, this is basically the chameleon who is masquerading as Steve Rogers. And the reason why is because they're basically carrying out a mission on behalf of Dr. Octopus. Now again, this is Dr. Octopus setting the stage for some much grander plans later on down the line. He's basically implementing his own scheme on the side. This entire conflict here is essentially designed to be a distraction. Not only that, Dr. Octopus actually has a lot of respect for Peter Parker. And this is why I say this is Dan Slott setting the stage for Dr. Octopus taking over the mind of Peter Parker doing Superior Spider-Man. Because what he says is, at this moment right now, Peter Parker is really, really smart. But Dr. Octopus also recognizes that a time will come, or at least in this almost immediate moment, that Peter Parker is going to find a way to basically deactivate all these different bombs that he has planted inside these devices around New York. And this is why I say that Peter Parker is just as smart as Reed Richards and Tony Stark, because what he does is he sits down and says, oh my God, I figured out what's going on. Because in their mind, in the mind of Reed Richards and Stark and so on, this countdown's going. And when it reaches 0, all these bombs are going to go off and New York is going to vanish off the face of the earth. But what Peter Parker realizes is that it's the first day of November, that it's basically daylight savings time. And so, Dr. Octavius or Dr. Octopus had taken this into account, that when Peter Parker figured out what was going on, that he would be able to set the timer back and give them an extra hour. Now, this, of course, allows Peter Parker and the various members of the Avengers to get these bombs out of here. But again, this was all just designed to be a ruse. It was designed to keep them focused on this one thing so that Dr. Octopus can implement his own plans. And what we'll find out with those plans will be later on. But from here, we transition to Frontline. Now, again, this is all part of the post-Civil War landscape. Remember, Frontline came to prominence with Ben Urich and Sally Floyd during Civil War, and it got a lot of popularity because it was basically covering the events of Civil War from the perspective of reporters, from non-superheroes, basically. And because of that, Ben Urich and Sally Floyd eventually left the Daily Bugle where they originally started out. They took the Frontline concept with them, basically this online posting source, and they launched their own publication house called Frontline. And that's what's happening with a lot of people here. A lot of folks like Robbie Robertson, they are all taking up residence as part of Frontline in place of the Daily Bugle. And so because of that, we again pick back up with Peter Parker. And the funny thing about this is, again, during Dan Slott's run, there was a girl named Michelle, and she had essentially become Peter Parker's roommate to a degree, and they really had a relationship, although it was more of a physical one, really, than an actual, we love each other on a solid scale. But this just came by way of Michelle's brother, being convicted of a crime, and her keeping an eye on her brother's place while he was gone. Peter Parker, of course, having been roommates with her brother before he was incarcerated. But this is, again, Dan Slott wrapping all these things up and axing all these things, removing them from the landscape. Because what happens is Peter comes home, and Michelle's like, yeah, I'm going back to Chicago now because my brother's out. And so, that's pretty much it. And so Peter Parker is more or less just kind of left to call around to different people and see if he can find a roommate, see if he can find a place to take up residence. Now, that's the cool thing here, is because this is Peter Parker just struggling with everyday things. He's like, well, my roommate's gone, so I got to find a new place. And he's got to do it quick, fast, and in a hurry. Of course, he goes to Carly, but their relationship is still pretty new. And so she's like, look, we more or less just started dating not too long ago. I'm not really comfortable with moving in. And so she basically says no, which is kind of messed up. Of course, he goes to Flash Thompson, and Flash Thompson's like, no, that's not going to happen, man. Like, you're not going to live with me. And he even goes to Mary Jane Watson. And the funny thing about this is Dan Slott, it was really kind of a funny moment, because it was like Dan Slott was toying with fans. It's like he was trolling Mary Jane Watson fans. Like, hey, you know how you guys really, really want to see Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson get back together? And fans are like, yeah. And he's like, well, that's not going to happen. And so, like, that he ends up having to leave. He ends up walking away, when the two of them agree not to be roommates together. And so ultimately he goes to Aunt May. Now, the cool thing about this is that Aunt May was already spending time, or at least already hanging out with the son of J. Jonah Jameson, along with J. Jonah Jameson Sr., the two of them, spending time with one another, hanging out, as well as a woman by the name of Dr. Madison Jameson. Now, the reason why Madison Jameson matters here is because Aunt May was telling her about Peter Parker, saying, hey, Peter Parker's a genius. He's one of the smartest people on the face of the planet. And so by the time Peter Parker arrives, starts knocking on the door of Aunt May and says, hey, would it be possible for me to crash here? Dr. Madison says, actually, your Aunt May has basically said that you're a genius. And I know of a guy who's very good at dealing with geniuses. And so what happens is Peter Parker is taken to Horizon Labs. Now, for those of you guys who were reading All New, All Different Amazing Spider-Man, and the first story arc saw the marriage of Max Modell and his significant other, what this was a continuation of this whole Horizon Labs story. This is where all this starts, is this whole Horizon Labs thing. It's the introduction of this. We kind of get the kicker. That's why I really wanted to cover this. It's really exciting. You guys will basically get everything that led to All New, All Different Amazing Spider-Man from the ground up. Like, you guys get it from the very beginning, which is why it's so cool. But Horizon Labs, as it's led by Max Modell, is like Peter Parker's playground. That's the best way to describe it. Max Modell, according to Peter Parker, was really his idol in a lot of different ways. Peter looked to Reed Richards, he looked to Tony Stark. Yeah, they're really smart, they're capable of great things. But in his mind, Max Modell was the guy to aspire to. Not only that, we get the introduction of a really cool guy named Grady Scraps. And I love Grady Scraps. But the gist of this is that Horizon Labs is essentially a think tank for some of the smartest people in the Marvel Universe. That's really all it is. It's a think tank for all these geniuses. And so it's a chance for them to just kind of run free and do whatever they want to. Now, what Max Modell says is that the way this is done, or the way Horizon Labs functions, is different than like Reed Richards' Future Foundation. It's different than like Tony Stark's whole initiative. The idea isn't to necessarily say, all right, guys, your assignment is to focus on this one thing and then go from there. It's basically, hey, do whatever you want to do. Like, just create whatever you want to create. Just get carried away, let your imagination run wild, because creativity only really comes when there is no constraint here, when there's no, confinement here. And so what ends up happening is we basically pick up with a woman named Sajani Joffrey, who's basically trying to create an artificial version of vibranium. Now, the reason why she's doing this is because this story takes place after an event called Doom War. And Doom War was a story where Dr. Doom invaded Wakanda for the purpose of capturing its vibranium. Now, while, Wakanda, its citizens are basically placed under control, they were dominated, that kind of thing, Black Panther and his sister Shuri were the only ones who remained out of the influence of this sphere of control. And so in the end, it was, they were successful in casting out Dr. Doom. But in the process, Black Panther basically rendered all the vibranium across the world inert. And so this had two effects. The first is that all vibranium everywhere, which had the mystical property of absorbing kinetic energy, it basically rendered all that obsolete. And so now vibranium was essentially worthless. The other effect was that because vibranium was basically worthless, Wakanda had no real value anymore. And so what's happening is people are basically scrambling to try to find vibranium, trying to find a way to duplicate it. And that's really what's happening here. The issue is that Sajani's created something called reverbium. Instead of absorbing sound, instead of absorbing energy, it reflects it and it amplifies it. And so essentially it's like turning the whole thing into a tuning fork. And that's really what happens here. As soon as it's activated, it's just like infinite amplification of sound to the point that it threatens to bring the entire building crashing down around it. Now, of course, Peter Parker is able to shut the system down. And so what happens is he's kind of given this pop quiz by Max Modell. The funny thing about this is that when they ask him questions like, well, we've developed an anti-gravity harness, what do we use for a braking system? When he's asked questions like, how do you contain a 3D object or a 2D object in a 3D space? When they're talking about how did, we've discovered some alien fungus, how do you slow its growth? He references his own experiences here. When he's dealing with Vulture, when he's dealing with Venom, he's referencing his own experience and going against these various villains and how he was able to defeat them. And so really it's him bringing his own experience to the table. And this is Dan Slott saying, no, Peter Parker's a genius. He's one of the smartest people out there. And so from here, it's really Spider-Man hitting the big time. It's the idea that he's finally experiencing success. He's finally having things go his way. And so as this little bit begins to wrap up, we're basically brought back, or at least we're reintroduced to the character of Roderick Kingsley, also known as the Hobgoblin. Now, the cool thing about the Hobgoblin is that he was actually created by Roger Stern to basically be a replacement for the Green Goblin. The way it worked out is in 1971, Jerry Conway had written a story called The Night Gwen Stacy Died, and that was the death of Gwen Stacy. It was one of the most landmark stories in the history of Peter Parker. But basically, it ended with the death of the Green Goblin. The issue was that Green Goblin was so popular by that point, or at least the idea of, Gwen Stacy dying because of either the actions of the Green Goblin or Spider-Man was such a controversial topic that's still being debated to this day that Marvel wanted to bring the Green Goblin back. But at the time, with Roger Stern writing Amazing Spider-Man, his idea was, I do not want to bring the Green Goblin back from the dead. Instead, I'm going to create somebody else and enter the Hobgoblin. Now, there have been different people who have played the role of Hobgoblin, and they've all had different aspects of the character that made them all unique. But for the character of Kingsley, and really for Hobgoblin as a whole, while he has come into contact with Peter Parker on several occasions, he always really seemed more like a mercenary than anything else, kind of like a soldier of fortune in the sense that he would just take contracts, he would implement those contracts, and that would be it. Now, with regards to the Hobgoblin as he exists right now, he's been contracted by Kingpin, and the reason for this is because Kingpin, has sources on the inside, there's guys on the inside of Horizon Labs, and Kingpin comes to the realization that, Joffrey's basically working on reverbium, and Kingpin basically says, hey, look, if this is a metal that can amplify sound, then what we're going to do is we're going to steal it, and we're literally going to weaponize it, and then sell it to any government that wants to buy it. Again, it's really just, it's just pure money grubbing here. When it comes to Kingpin, that's really all this aspect of the story is. But what happens is Kingsley travels to what used to be the domain of Norman Osborn, because keep in mind, this is after the events of Dark Reign, this is after the events of Siege, and so Norman Osborn is no longer a main character. Instead, he's very much just gone from the public eye. And so because of that, when Kingsley actually gets into Norman Osborn's lab and starts going through his personal things, he's met by Phil Urich. Now, Phil Urich is one of the people who was associated with the Daily Bugle, and his whole idea is that he's basically the nephew of the now famous Ben Urich, who did so much reporting during the events of Civil War. But what happens is Phil Urich, while he's being attacked by a Hobgoblin, essentially just freaks. Now with Phil Urich, the funny thing about him is that he was a goblin at one point in time. In fact, he was the Green Goblin during the events of the Onslaught saga, so it's not like he's brand new to all this. He's not a creation by Dan Slott. Instead, for the character of Phil Urich, this is a return to familiarity in a lot of different ways, except now he's taking on the role of Hobgoblin. Now, as far as I'm aware, the only goblin role that Phil Urich played up to this point was the Green Goblin. I may be wrong, although I don't think I am, but if I am, feel free to correct me down there. But as far as I'm aware, he was only ever only ever the Green Goblin. But taking over the role of Hobgoblin, what's really interesting about this is that it really shines into effect the nature of the Kingpin, in the sense that Kingpin doesn't really care who it is that fulfills a contract, as long as what he's trying to acquire is brought in. You know, as long as what it is that he's looking for is brought to him. Now, at this point, we basically pick up in City Hall. And again, this is really kind of funny here because J. Jonah Jameson still hates the idea of Spider-Man. I mean, he's always going to hate Spider-Man. And what's kind of cool is Captain America shows up and says, hey, look, I really want Spider-Man to receive, like, you're doing the whole honorary thing of the key to the city. I really think Spider-Man should be the one to get this. Now, this immediately strikes, you know, this immediately strikes J. Jonah Jameson as, no, that's not going to happen. I absolutely hate Spider-Man. I'm not going to give it to him. I'm going to give it to my son. Now, the funny thing about this is that his son shows up, you know, and he says, hey, you know, I would love to have the key to the city, but I really do think it needs to go to Spider-Man because he's done so many great deeds. So it's not the most significant thing in the world. It's just kind of funny to see J. Jonah Jameson being put in such a strange situation. But again, picking back up again with Horizon Labs, this is when we really start to get this full explanation from Max Modell, in the sense that we're introduced to a few other characters here and there, you know, a few more members, which is part of the Elite Seven, or the not really like the Secret Seven, but it's part of like the top 7 people who were there, the ones that can come and go as they please, work on whatever it is that they want to. And Peter Parker is basically given his own lab. He's given the ability to work on whatever it is that he wants to work on. The issue with this is that while he's in the middle of studying, while he's in the middle of reading what he needs to read and try to get things in order, the entire Horizon Labs facility is immediately attacked by the Hobgoblin. Now, this is actually kind of cool because Dan Slott was messing around with us a little bit. I mean, we would sit here and we would think, well, these are some of the smartest people on the face of the planet. And so if Peter Parker's suddenly not there and Spider-Man is there, then it would seem like the easiest thing to figure out, or the easiest thing to understand, or to, you know, come to the conclusion of, is that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Not only that, remember, Phil Urich has his, you know, goblin scream, so to speak, which basically, you know, it wreaks all kinds of havoc in the sense that it's basically a sonic scream. And so because of this, it incapacitates Peter Parker, you know, it causes physical reactions in the sense that he's bleeding out of his eyes, you know, and so what happens is, in the middle of this conflict, Peter Parker is able to make his escape by the skin of his pants. Max Modell yanks the fire alarm, and what it does is it kind of balances things out a bit, in the sense that it more or less sends, you know, the Hobgoblin off, just kind of running for the middle of nowhere. Spider-Man, of course, chases after him, and it's kind of this cat and mouse game. And the sense that Spider-Man's trying to figure out why Hobgoblin's come back. He's trying to figure out while he's there, but in the end, it doesn't really matter because Hobgoblin's able to make off with this Reverbium as it's been created by Sajani Joffrey. And so one of the funny moments here, this is why I love this so much, is at this point, you know, once it's all said and done, we have Captain Watanabe of the New York Police Department that shows up. And of course, Peter Parker, changing out of his Spider-Man uniform, has to come up with an excuse for why it is that he wasn't out there, when one of the people was like, hey, I took a head count and Peter Parker's not here. When they go into his lab, he's wearing headphones and he's naked. And his response is that, well, this is how I function. Like, I put headphones on, I listen to music, you know, I study when I'm naked. You know, it was the only excuse that he could come up with, spur of the moment. And this is why so many fans loved Peter Parker, because it was just small moments like this that were absolutely hilarious. It was small moments like this that were amazing. But at this point, we pick up with Hobgoblin joining Wilson Fisk. And this is why I say Wilson Fisk doesn't really care what goes on with a contract. Instead, he says, where's Roderick Kingsley? Like, where's Kingsley at? And the response of you know, Phil Urich, Hobgoblin, is, it doesn't really matter. Like, it doesn't matter at all. I mean, he's gone. He's dead. You know, but the contract's been fulfilled. And Kingpin says, cool beans. Now, the funny thing is he doesn't really trust Kingsley that much. He's not really sure how he feels about him, but he did uphold the contract. He did fulfill what it was that Kingpin was looking for, and that's all he ever really cares about. Now, at this point, we rejoin Black Cat, and that's why I say she was going to have more of a significant role later on in the story, and I love what Dan Slott does with this. Historically speaking, there's always been this sort of cat and mouse game, not to make a pun, but there's always been this sort of cat and mouse game between Peter Parker and Black Cat, in the sense that it was always this sort of will they, won't they kind of thing. You know, like, are they ever going to get together? Are they ever going to actually have any real measure of an ongoing relationship? And that's really what Dan Slott does here. He toys with the notion there's a lot of sexual tension between the two of them, and a lot of jokes that go on between the two of them. But at the end of the day, it's always Peter Parker saying, hey, this is why we don't date. This is why we don't get together. But what Black Cat also says is that by way of her sources, she's come to the realization, or she's been informed, that the buyer of the Reverbium that was stolen from Horizon Labs is Kingpin. And so this really brings Spider-Man back into contact with Wilson Fisk again. again. Now, at this point, he says, of course, meet me at this location. The two of them end up getting together, and a box just lands behind Black Cat. When she opens it up, there's glasses, there's an earpiece. The glasses say put this on, or the goggles say put this on. When she does, she realizes that Peter Parker has a new suit, that he basically has a stealth suit. And what he says is this suit is designed to eliminate sound and eliminate people being able to see him, in the sense that it minimalizes all of it. And so, or I guess minimizes all of it. And so it's really his own stealth variation of what Tony Stark had done before, where he had made a stealth suit. And so this basically allows them to infiltrate Kingpin's base of operations in Shadowland and attempt to try to retrieve the Reverbium. Now, something else to keep in mind here is that at this point, again, Phil Urich Hobgoblin is very much in the employ of Kingpin, not to mention that Kingpin himself also has, members of the Hand. Now, something that I want to point out here is that the Hand is this really clandestine organization of ninjas based out of Japan that go back quite some time. But overall, the gist is twofold when it comes to the Hand. The first is to infiltrate various, governmental agencies, subvert them from the inside out, operate from the shadows, that kind of thing. But they're basically also for hire, in the sense that if you have enough money, you can pay members of the Hand to carry out assassinations. Woe betide you if you don't pay them, but you can you can hire them for the purpose of making assassinations, being bodyguards, things like that. And that's kind of the interesting thing, is because the Hand are some of the best assassins in the entirety of the Marvel Universe. And so if you have them as bodyguards, you're almost guaranteed to stay safe, only with the exception of a few people here and there who can basically subvert them. Wolverine is a good example, Elektra is a good example, different things like that. But in the midst of all this, with Hobgoblin, basically responding to what seems to be a break-in with, Peter Parker arriving here along with Black Cat actually leaves Peter hanging. She kind of bails out in the middle of it and says, hey, I was here to help you get this, but I'm literally a cat burglar, and I know a losing game when I see one, so you're on your own. And she says, all I'm going to do is go to, Wilson Fisk's personal office, steal some of his private collection, and then sell it. Of course, Wilson Fisk's head of security, so to speak, figures out what's going on with Black Cat. He's able to subdue her, and when she's in the clutches of Kingpin, the funny thing about this is that, Peter Parker's suit is designed to block out all methods of communication. Not only that, Hobgoblin had basically used his sonic scream in order to overpower the stealth suit, or the stealth aspect of Peter Parker's suit, which he responds in kind by, again, basically blocking out all sound in order to keep the Hobgoblin sonic scream from affecting him. But the issue here is that he's oblivious to what's going on with regards to Felicia Hardy. He has no idea what's happening with regards to her being taken by the Kingpin. And so in the end, what really ends up happening here is just a matter of circumstance that leads to Felicia Hardy, getting free, Spider-Man being able to make his escape, in the sense that the sonic scream of Hobgoblin reflects off the Reverbium and literally begins to start bringing the building crashing down around him. And so, of course, Peter's able to jump in, he's able to save Felicia, he goes against the Kingpin for a little while, but that's really about it. I mean, he just kind of whisks
Okay, guys,
and,
I am going to stop this here and say thank you very much for watching. I might do an extra few tweaks, so don't forget to keep checking it over on Instagram, where I probably might possibly finish this off, but I'm kind of happy with the way it is. So I'm going to leave it here, guys, and I say thank you very, very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Don't forget to click the links that will appear at the end of the stream. Let me know what you think of this in the comment section, and leave a like if you do. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new to the channel, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will say goodbye.